Hey everybody, welcome to Nerdy Inc.'s newest podcast called Our Favorite Frontier, which is a Star Trek podcast devoted to Star Trek because I love Star Trek. With me is, you know him from the Mario Party 2 Let's Play, my good friend Nick.
How are you guys doing?
And basically what this podcast is going to be starting next week is going to be basically a weekly Star Trek The Next Generation review, analysis, discussion, whatever kind of show. Today we're just going to do sort of a little introductions to who we are as well as our history with Star Trek. And then starting next week we will pick it up with Season 1, Episode 1 of Star Trek The Next Generation. The reason why I want to talk about our history with Star Trek is because I am a huge Star Trek fan. I've seen, the original series, TNG, Deep Space Nine, etc., as well as all of the movies. I've basically seen everything Star Trek except for the animated series.
I, for one, have seen very little Star Trek things. Most of my Star Trek knowledge comes from pop culture and, references, and one Family Guy episode where the cast of TNG is in it. And a few original series episodes I do tend to enjoy.
Yes, I know together you and I have watched the episode City on the Edge of Forever, and we've watched The Enemy Within, but I think you've seen a couple more besides that, right?
I have seen a couple more, but I usually just watch The Enemy Within because I love Evil Kirk.
Yes.
I want to be Evil Kirk for Halloween. I just need my brother to come to town, or I have to go down there, and he could be good Kirk, and I'll just be Evil Kirk with the eyeliner.
And you just have to go, I want to live!
I want to live! I
want to live! And what movies have you seen, right?
Now, I saw Wrath of Khan, and I did enjoy it, though... I think that was right after we saw that one episode together at your house. So I had very little Star Trek knowledge, so I just kind of watched it for what it was. As, a movie of revenge and...
adventure in space.
And all that stuff, and obviously some tragedy along with that. And then I tried to watch the one where William Shatner has curly gray hair, and I fell asleep.
The Undiscovered Country?
It's the one you did tell me to watch it. Is it 6?
It's probably 6, The Undiscovered Country.
Yeah, because you said 5 wasn't up to par to your standard.
5 is the trash one that William Shatner directed and became an ego project.
Yeah, so I did not watch that. I was trying to watch 6 and I fell asleep.
Cool. Okay, so we'll just say you're not a Trek fan.
I haven't really seen anything. I'm inexperienced or adolescent.
So, as an inexperienced Trek fan, what is your understanding of what Star Trek is?
So, what I seem to have gathered is that Star Trek, at least in the original series, is kind of like the Twilight Zone in space. So, you have a weird predicament that the characters go through when they try to solve it. Whether it be, body splitting into good and evil, to time travel to try to stop someone from changing the time patterns, to people who are just not whom they seem. So in the original series, from what I've gathered, it's kind of like a Twilight Zone-y in space.
Yes, that's quite a bit of what the original series is. There's what would happen if the gang was flying through space and found a planet full of Nazis? Just stuff like that.
Is that an episode?
That is a real episode, yes.
Is that an original series episode?
It's an original series episode.
And they're real Nazis.
I mean, they're not from Germany. It's a whole big thing. But there's in the original series, you got a Nazi planet, you got a 1930s gangster planet, you've got a hippie love planet where flowers shoot spores at you that turn you into a hippie. There's all sorts of crazy stuff.
Now, this is what I'm talking about.
Yeah, so this is the original series.
Okay, so it's campy and stuff, and more family-friendly, I'm assuming,
yes,
in comparison to probably some darker material up ahead.
Well, in terms of darkness, TNG rarely goes dark. It's still stuck to Gene Roddenberry's original vision, which I'll talk about in a sec, but it started out very much like that. We're flying through space, we find a thing what happens. And then as the series progressed and the characters grew, you got some more personal episodes, you got some more character episodes, you get like Tapestry, The Inner Light. Those two things mean nothing to you, but they will. So you get a lot more stuff later on with TNG, and then when you get to Deep Space Nine, things get real dark.
Now, is Deep Space Nine a continuation of the Next Generation?
It isn't in the timeline. Yes, it does take place concurrently and then after the Next Generation, but it's not the same characters. No, it's different characters.
Now, another question I have. Is there references or is there any odes to the original series in the Next Generation, or is it a completely on its own style series?
Yes, there are references. There are even some character crossovers.
Ooh.
Because Star Trek The Next Generation was airing right around the time that Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, and Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country were coming out. So those 3 movies were being produced while TNG was being made. So now I want to talk just a little bit more about sort of the history of Star Trek, in that for someone who doesn't understand Star Trek, lots of fans listening to this, I assume I'm going to get more Star Trek fans than not Star Trek fans listening to this, but for people like you, I think it's a good idea to explain where Star Trek is coming from and where Gene Roddenberry is coming from. And so I want to contrast that with something that is a bit more ubiquitous and more people know, which is Star Wars. Star Wars is you have your space adventure. It's a little more action heavy, a little more emotional, but one of the big things that sort of permeates Star Wars is this sort of underdog mentality. Rebellion is a huge part of Star Wars because the good guys are the rebels and the Empire is the bad guy. And when Star Trek is quote unquote at its best, when Star Wars is at its best, it's underdogs fighting a giant evil power. That's sort of flipped in Star Trek because the good guys are the establishment. And the reasoning behind that is because George Lucas, when he grew up, he was a product of the 60s. There was an unpopular war being waged by the United States, and the young kids were the rebels, protesting sort of what their government was doing that they didn't like. Whereas Gene Roddenberry grew up and served in World War II, the war where the United States was pretty much the good guy across all terms. No one really argues that the U.S. was the bad guy in World War II. And then Roddenberry, his father was a police officer. Gene Roddenberry became a police officer before he became a writer. So there was always a trust in authority that Gene Roddenberry had, and that's why in Star Trek you have the good guys are the establishment. Starfleet is the good guys. And that's sort of one of the things that makes Star Trek so interesting is you have this society that has progressed beyond the need for money. No one's really greedy. No one really wants anything. People have put together all the differences and get along for the sake of the species and for the betterment of all of mankind or life kind, I guess. So that's one of the big things that's necessary to know about Star Trek is that it's got a very, very, very optimistic view of the future, as opposed to Star Wars, which, granted, that's, I guess, the past, but it's a little bit more it's pessimistic and rebellious and more, you gotta fight. Whereas Star Trek says that fighting is not cool, bruh.
That was the lamest thing I ever heard you say.
Yeah, well, it's a Star Trek podcast. You expect me to be cool?
Well, I mean, you even got so uncool that the Star Trek podcast was now uncool because of that last bra statement. You made Star Trek uncool.
There's a lot more of that to come
now
in the coming weeks.
Now, so you're saying we're living in this sort of, I wouldn't say utopia society, but it sounds like people, from what I gathered, everyone's pretty okay with the establishment.
I would say that it's a utopia for the planets that are in the Federation. Earth. If you go to Earth and you look at Earth in a vacuum, you would say that Earth is now a utopia. Where the utopia starts to disappear and you have a little more friction is, on the edge of that the Klingon Empire, where the Klingons, they have an agreement, they have understanding, but their culture's a little different, so they're not necessarily, they do bump heads with the Federation now and again. And then you go even further out, and then you got the Romulans, who are not part of the Federation. You have these clear borders in space. So the people who are within the Federation, I would say, it's a utopia for them. But it's once you start to mix in these other powers in the galaxy, because the entire thing takes place in the Milky Way galaxy, all the powers in that galaxy, then you start to have problems.
So, like, obviously, this wouldn't be a show if there was no conflict.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned that, because one of the things, if you've never watched TNG and you're gonna maybe watch with us week by week, or if you are Nick and I'm going to force you to watch the show. Basically, the first season sucks so bad. The first season is not good television, and one of the reasons for that is Gene Roddenberry said, there are no conflicts. People get along. And the writers had a hard time working with that because you need conflict in your writing. And Gene Roddenberry, started to step away in the second season when his health started to go downhill, and they started introducing a little bit more conflicts. And season 2 got a little bit better, and then season 3 got really good. So no, there was no conflict in the early seasons, and I think that was to the show's detriment. Everyone got along perfectly all the time, and so you had to rely on sort of goofy, wacky space antics. Whereas once you could have a little bit more friction, then you could get into some of the heavier ethical dilemmas that ultimately make TNG so great.
It's a priority.
Yeah.
So for
comedy too, for anything.
So for a good 2 seasons of this show, you're going to be hearing me being very blah about the show, I'm assuming.
For the first season, you will be blah about the show.
So I just want to tell our viewers I'm sorry for being such a pessimist if I have to be.
And but you know what? That's going to be good because I'm also going to be pessimistic. But if you're watching the show and you think season 1 sucks and you say, how are there 7 seasons of it? Take my word when I say it gets great.
Okay.
You'll see nuggets in the first season. Can't think off the top of my head. I perused the list today. I don't recall there being anything particularly memorable in the first season, like good wise. I looked at it and I said, I remember seeing, I remember that episode. And there are a couple nuggets of that could have been interesting and missed opportunities. The second season starts to really address some of those problems, and there are some bad episodes in season 2, but they start to pull together. And then season 3, it takes off and is great and amazing and wonderful.
Well, with today's television, it's mostly if your pilot isn't good, you're not really going to be capturing that much of an audience. Like Game of Thrones, for example. I mean, that's probably the best thing. You watch an entire episode of Game of Thrones, you want to see, like, oh, can I get into the show? Let's just watch the pilot. By the end of that, you want to see what happens for the rest of the time in that world. And that's how I felt when I saw the first episode of Game of Thrones.
Yeah, it's a miracle that Star Trek: The Next Generation exists, because the pilot is frustrating.
You are killing me.
I know. I'm trying not to bum you out too much here, but it's a frustrating pilot. It's not to say it's not interesting and there's not good ideas buried deep under there, but it's just goofy.
Can we just do a podcast on The Enemy Within?
And just every week talk about
that particular episode, because I just find it fantastic. With
I'm
Doghorn
Captain Kirk.
And Sulu asking for some coffee because he's too cold.
I'm Captain Kirk.
I'm Captain Kirk.
I want to live.
I want to live.
Well, actually, if there's one TOS episode you should watch, besides the Nazi Planet one, which I'll look up for you, watch The Naked Time, which is the one in which The Naked Time. Okay. It's the one where you might know it as the episode where Sulu gets drunk and runs around with a shirtless, swinging a fencing foil.
The one where he's like everyone gets like kind of some sort of infection when they start acting really crazy.
Yeah.
I saw that one.
Oh, okay, great, good, because there's a there's a pseudo sequel to that in the first season of TNG. So.
Ooh, I can dig it.
But other than that, I think that's going to wrap. This will be a short episode because there's not a whole lot to talk about this week. We're just sort of establishing what this is going to be. But starting next week, Encounter at Farpoint, parts 1 and 2. It's a 2-part episode.
It's a 2-part episode?
Yeah, it's an hour-and-a-half pilot. So.
Oh, and you told me it's rough? Oh, God.
Yeah, so get a beer. Have a beer handy.
If I have a beer, Alex, I'm going to fall asleep.
Well, have a beer on deck.
You got it.
So, yeah, that's it. Obviously this is very freeform right now. We're still sort of figuring out the structure of the show. I'm sure we'll come up with a general sign-off, fun comment. I don't know. We'll figure out something to do for a little bit more audience interaction as we sort of progress with the show. But as for right now, strap in, everyone, because we're gonna make it so. Whatever.
I was literally just gonna say that.
Make it so. Whatever. Who knows?
That's the only quote I know.
Yeah, that's all you need to know. That and tea, Earl Grey, hot. Those are the 2 big ones for now.
Now you gotta be all confused with the Earl Grey talk.
Yeah, well, that's Picard's favorite drink.
Interesting.
Yeah. So that'll be it for this week. Tune in next week when we get to the Encounter at Farpoint, and we talk about that. Until then, I'm Alex.
I'm Nick.
And we will see you next time.
Our Favorite Frontier is hosted by Alex Russo and Nick Caladona, edited by Alex Russo, and produced by Nerdy Inc. Be sure to follow us on YouTube to catch all of our videos, as well as like us on Facebook, Twitter, and whatever other social media we have.